I was 23 years old when my father died, and I truly believed the hardest part would be learning how to live without him. I had no idea the funeral wasn't the end of my family's nightmare. It was only the beginning. My dad built his business from nothing. Literally nothing. He used to tell me that his first office wasn't an office at all. It was the back seat of a rusty Ford pickup where he kept invoices in a cardboard box because he couldn't afford a filing cabinet. By the time I was born, he owned a small but respected commercial construction company just outside Columbus, Ohio. We weren't rich enough to own yachts or vacation homes, but we lived comfortably. My parents paid every bill on time, my sister and I attended decent schools, and every Friday night Dad would bring home pizza and insist that no business meeting was more important than family dinner. He believed people mattered more than money. That was probably his biggest weakness. My Uncle Richard, Dad's younger brother, had worked with him almost since the beginning. If you asked anyone in town, they'd tell you they were partners. Dad handled clients, employees, and relationships. Richard handled contracts, suppliers, and finances. Growing up, I admired my uncle. He always arrived in a shiny new truck while my father drove the same old pickup for almost 12 years. Richard wore expensive watches. Dad wore the same scratched silver watch my mom had given him when they got married. At the time, I thought my uncle was simply better with money. I couldn't have been more wrong. The phone call came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Mom screamed so loudly from the kitchen that I thought someone had broken into the house. I ran downstairs and found her collapsed on the floor, still clutching the phone. She looked at me with tears pouring down her face. There was an accident. Those 4 words changed everything. Dad had been driving back from a job site when a semi-truck lost control on an icy highway. The state trooper told us he never suffered. I wanted to believe him. The funeral was packed. More than 200 people came. Employees cried. Clients cried. Neighbors cried. Men twice my father's size couldn't finish their speeches without breaking down. I remember standing beside the casket thinking that someone who touched this many lives couldn't possibly be gone forever. Then I noticed Uncle Richard. He wasn't crying. He looked distracted. He kept stepping outside to answer phone calls. Every 20 minutes he'd disappear, whisper into his phone, then come back inside wearing the same fake expression of grief. At the time, I assumed he was handling business emergencies. Now I know exactly what he was doing. 3 days after the funeral, Richard asked Mom if we could all meet at the company office. "I'll explain everything," he said. "Your brother trusted me with the business." Those words sounded comforting. Instead, they became the beginning of the biggest betrayal our family would ever experience. The office felt different without Dad. His coffee mug was still sitting on his desk. His reading glasses rested on an open folder exactly where he'd left them. For a second, I expected him to walk through the door complaining that someone had moved his tape measure again. Instead, Richard walked in carrying a thick stack of legal papers. He didn't ask how Mom was doing. He didn't ask how my younger sister Emily was coping. He sat down and slid a folder across the conference table. "I think it's best if we handle this quickly." My mother frowned. "What exactly are we handling?" Richard folded his hands together. "The company." I expected him to say we'd all work together until things settled down. Instead, he cleared his throat. "Technically, the business belongs to me now." The room went silent. I actually laughed. I thought he was joking. He wasn't. "What are you talking about?" Mom asked. Richard opened the folder and pointed toward several documents. "Your husband transferred majority ownership years ago." Mom stared at him. "No, he didn't." "He absolutely did. He would have told me." Richard sighed dramatically. "Linda, your husband trusted me to protect the company." Something felt wrong. Dad discussed everything with Mom. Every investment, every major purchase, every financial decision. He would have never signed away his life's work without mentioning it. I looked at the paperwork. Most of it meant nothing to me. Legal language, corporate filings, signatures, stamps. Richard noticed me staring. "You don't understand business law." "No," I replied, "but I understand my father." For the first time, Richard's smile disappeared. He looked directly into my eyes. "You're young, emotional. This isn't the time to start making accusations." Mom asked to see the documents. Richard hesitated, only for a second. Then he handed them over. She flipped through the pages slowly. Her hands began shaking. "I've never seen these before. They were signed years ago. My husband would have told me." He didn't. I watched something inside my mother break. Not because she believed him. Because she realized proving him wrong would be almost impossible. Richard stood up. "The company's lawyers have already reviewed everything." That sentence hit me harder than anything else. The company's lawyers. Not our lawyers. His lawyers. He had already prepared for this. Weeks. Months. Years. I didn't know. But this wasn't something he came up with after Dad died. It felt planned. Mom quietly asked one question. What happens to us? Richard didn't even hesitate. The company can't afford to continue supporting the family. Supporting the family. He said it like we were strangers. Like we hadn't sacrificed weekends, holidays, and birthdays helping build that company. Dad missed baseball games because of that business. Mom answered emergency calls at midnight. I spent entire summers cleaning warehouses for minimum wage because Dad believed every family member should earn their place. And now, we were being treated like outsiders. Emily started crying. She was only 16. She didn't fully understand contracts or ownership percentages. She only understood that the man she'd called uncle her entire life was taking away the business Grandpa helped Dad build. Mom looked at Richard one last time. Your brother trusted you. Richard adjusted his tie. I know. No apology. No guilt. Nothing. Just those two words. As we walked toward the parking lot, I turned around and saw workers gathering near the loading dock. Many of them looked confused. One of Dad's oldest employees hurried over. His name was Mike. He'd worked with Dad for almost 25 years. I'm so sorry about your father, he said. Then he lowered his voice. Something isn't right. What do you mean? Mike looked over his shoulder to make sure Richard wasn't nearby. Richard started changing things before your dad passed. I frowned. Changing what? Bank accounts. My stomach tightened. Payroll systems. What? Suppliers. When? Mike hesitated. About 6 months ago. 6 months. Dad was alive, healthy, working every day. So why didn't Dad stop him? Mike looked uncomfortable. I assumed your father approved everything. That answer haunted me all the way home. Had Dad approved it? Or had Richard been moving pieces without anyone noticing? That night our house felt painfully quiet. Mom sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills. Dad had always handled the finances. She kept opening envelopes she'd never needed to worry about before. Mortgage, insurance, property taxes, utility bills. Reality arrived faster than grief. 2 weeks later, the first shock came. The company health insurance ended. Then the company vehicle was taken back. Then Dad's business credit cards were canceled. One thing after another. Each letter felt like another reminder that Richard wasn't just taking the company. He was erasing my father from it. I decided to visit the office alone. I wanted answers. The receptionist I'd known since childhood wouldn't even look me in the eye. I'm sorry, she whispered. Richard said you're not allowed inside. I stared at her. I grew up here. She looked like she wanted to cry. I know. Before I could say another word, Richard walked out of Dad's old office. Except, it wasn't Dad's office anymore. The family photos were gone. The framed picture of my parents on opening day had disappeared. Even Dad's old coffee mug was missing. Richard smiled. Can I help you? I couldn't believe he had the nerve to ask. That's my father's office. No, he corrected calmly. It's the owner's office. I felt my fists clench. You stole this company. His smile faded. Careful. No. You have no proof. I'll find it. Richard stepped closer until we were standing inches apart. You know what your father never understood. I didn't answer. He thought kindness built businesses. Richard straightened his expensive suit jacket. It doesn't. Then he looked me dead in the eyes and said the sentence that changed the course of my entire life. It builds victims. Security escorted me out before I could respond. Standing in that parking lot, staring at the building my father had spent 30 years creating, I made myself one promise. I didn't care if it took 5 years, 10 years, or 20. One day, I would build something bigger than the company my uncle stole. And when that day came, he wouldn't lose because of revenge. He'd lose because the people who once believed in him would finally see the kind of man he had always been.
For the first few weeks after everything happened, I kept expecting someone to call and tell us there had been a mistake. Maybe a lawyer would discover forged paperwork. Maybe one of Dad's old partners would come forward. Maybe Uncle Richard would suddenly grow a conscience. None of that happened. Life didn't pause because we were grieving. The mortgage payment was due. The electric company still expected their money. My sister still needed school supplies. And the refrigerator didn't magically fill itself because my father had been a good man. It took less than 2 months for our comfortable middle-class life to disappear. The first thing Mom sold was Dad's fishing boat. It wasn't even about the money. She couldn't bear to look at it sitting in the driveway anymore. Dad used to take Emily and me fishing every Memorial Day weekend. He never caught much, but somehow he always convinced us it was the best trip of the year. Watching a stranger hook the trailer to that boat felt like losing another piece of him. Mom stood at the kitchen window while the buyer drove away. She didn't cry. That somehow hurt more. When people stop crying, it usually means reality has settled in. A few weeks later, we canceled cable. Then the internet was downgraded. Then we started comparing grocery prices between 4 different stores just to save $20. I learned something during that time. People don't notice when you're climbing. They notice when you're falling. Friends who used to invite us over every weekend slowly disappeared. Some of Dad's business contacts stopped returning Mom's phone calls. Even neighbors became awkward. Nobody wanted to choose sides between a grieving family and a successful businessman. Success has a strange way of making people ignore the truth. Richard was still driving his new trucks, still sponsoring local charity events, still smiling for newspaper photos. To everyone else, he looked like the man who had saved the company after my father's tragic death. Only we knew the cost of that success. I applied for every job I could find. Construction, warehouses, delivery driving, retail, anything. Most employers ask the same question. Do you have experience? I wanted to laugh. I'd spent my entire life around construction sites. I knew how projects worked. I knew how crews operated. I knew how to read blueprints because Dad had taught me when I was 16. But none of that mattered without official titles or certifications. Eventually, a warehouse hired me for $14 an hour. It wasn't glamorous. My job was unloading trucks for 10 hours a day. By the time I got home, my back hurt so much I could barely climb the stairs. Mom pretended everything was fine. Every night she'd smile and asked how work went. Every night I'd tell her it was okay. Both of us were lying. One evening I walked into the kitchen and found her staring at a stack of unopened envelopes. She quickly pushed them aside when she saw me. It's nothing. I picked one up. Final notice. Another one. Past due. Then another. Property tax reminder. She looked embarrassed. I was trying to figure out which bill we could pay this month. That sentence stayed with me for years. Not which bills. Which bill, because we couldn't afford them all. A month later, Mom got a job as a receptionist at a dental clinic. She hadn't worked outside the home in over 20 years. On her first day, she asked Emily to help her learn how to use Microsoft Excel. Watching my 50-year-old mother take notes from a teenager broke something inside me. She should have been planning vacations with Dad. Instead, she was learning spreadsheet shortcuts because we couldn't survive on my paycheck. Alone, Emily changed too. She stopped asking for new clothes. She stopped going out with friends. When her high school announced the senior trip to Washington, D.C., she quietly told everyone she wasn't interested. I later found the permission slip hidden in her bedroom trash can. She knew we couldn't afford it, so she made it look like it was her choice. That was the moment I realized betrayal doesn't just steal money. It steals childhoods. One Saturday afternoon, I drove past Dad's old company by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident. Part of me still hoped I'd wake up from this nightmare. The parking lot was full. New company signs had been installed. Richard's name was printed in large silver letters across the front entrance. Not my father's, Richard's. It was like 30 years of hard work had been erased with fresh paint. Across the street, I parked my truck and just watched. Employees came and went. Some of them had worked for Dad for decades. I wondered if they thought about him, or if people simply move on faster than we'd like to believe. Then I noticed someone walking toward my truck. It was Mike, Dad's old foreman. He climbed into the passenger seat without saying a word. "You shouldn't sit here," he finally said. "I know. They'll think you're causing trouble." "I'm just looking." Mike sighed. "You look tired." "I am." For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he reached into his jacket and handed me a folded envelope. "What's this?" "Open it later." Before getting out, he said something I'll never forget. "Your father used to say that buildings don't stand because of concrete." I looked at him. "They stand because people trust whoever poured the foundation." Then he walked away. When I got home, I opened the envelope. Inside were copies of invoices, bank transfer records, supplier agreements. Some had dates from almost a year before Dad died. Others had Richard's signature. At first, they didn't make much sense. But one thing stood out immediately. Several suppliers that had worked with Dad for years had suddenly been replaced. Payments were being redirected through companies I'd never heard of. There were handwritten notes in the margins. Mike's handwriting. "Ask why this vendor changed." Asterisk. "Richard approved without Tom." Asterisk. "Dad looked confused during meeting." Asterisk. My heart started racing. It wasn't proof of theft, but it was proof that something unusual had been happening long before the accident. I spent every evening studying those papers. The more I learned, the more I realized how little I actually knew about business. Dad had always protected me from the stressful parts. He taught me how to treat employees, how to negotiate fairly, how to earn respect, but he never expected to die at 54. He never had the chance to teach me how companies could be stolen without anyone breaking a window. One night I asked Mom something that had been bothering me. Did Dad ever argue with Richard? She looked surprised. "Not often. Never." She thought for a moment. "The last few months, yes." "What about?" He never said. "Did he seem worried?" She nodded slowly. "Very." She walked into the living room and returned with Dad's old leather notebook. "I found this while cleaning the garage." Most pages were filled with measurements, client notes, and project sketches. Then, near the back, I found a sentence written in thick black ink. "Need to review financial reports myself. Too many things aren't adding up." Asterisk. There was no explanation, no names, just that one sentence. My hands started shaking. Dad knew, maybe not everything, but he knew something was wrong. He simply ran out of time. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the ceiling thinking about all the conversations Dad and Richard must have had. Had Dad confronted him? Had Richard lied? Had my father died believing he could still fix everything? Or had he trusted the wrong person until the very end? The next morning I made a decision. I stopped looking for revenge. Revenge wouldn't pay our bills. Revenge wouldn't save our house. What I wanted was something bigger. I wanted to understand business better than Richard ever had. I wanted to become the kind of businessman my father would have respected. Not because I wanted to destroy my uncle. Because I never wanted anyone to do to another family what he'd done to ours. That afternoon, after finishing my warehouse shift, I drove to the public library instead of going home. I checked out every book I could find on construction management, accounting, contracts, negotiations, and entrepreneurship. The librarian smiled as she stamped the books. Starting a business, I smiled back for the first time in months. Not yet, but one day. I didn't know how, I didn't know when, I only knew one thing. The man who walked into that library was no longer the same young guy who had been thrown out of his father's office. For the first time since Dad died, I wasn't thinking about what we'd lost. I was thinking about what I was going to build. The first business book I ever finished wasn't inspiring. It was confusing. Half the words sounded like another language. Cash flow, margins, equity, overhead, working capital. I had spent my entire life believing construction companies were built with concrete, steel, and hard work. I was wrong. They were built with numbers, and the people who understood those numbers controlled everything. Every evening after my warehouse shift, I drove straight to the public library. The librarians started recognizing me. I'd sit in the same corner every night with a notebook, a cheap coffee, and a stack of books taller than my laptop. Some nights I understood only 2 pages. Other nights I copied entire chapters by hand because I couldn't afford to buy the books. People imagine revenge as anger. Mine looked more like exhaustion. While my friends were getting married, taking vacations, or watching football on Sundays, I was learning accounting from free YouTube videos and reading contract law at midnight. Nobody applauds that part of the story. Nobody sees the years where nothing exciting happens. But those years change everything. One afternoon, my warehouse manager asked if I wanted extra hours unloading freight on weekends. The pay wasn't much better, but I accepted immediately. Every extra dollar had a purpose. Half went toward helping Mom with bills. The other half went into an old metal toolbox hidden under my bed. That wasn't savings. That was my future business fund. I refused to touch it. Not for birthdays, not for Christmas, not even when my truck's transmission failed. I rode 2 buses to work for almost 4 months instead. Mom found out one evening. You should have told me. And done what? She looked guilty. We would have figured something out. I smiled. We are figuring it out. She hugged me longer than usual. For the first time since Dad passed away, I felt like she believed tomorrow might actually be better than today. The year after Dad's death, Emily graduated high school. She received a scholarship to Ohio State. Not a full scholarship, just enough to make college possible if we all sacrificed. The night before she left, she knocked on my bedroom door. I need to tell you something. She sat on the edge of my bed. I almost didn't apply. Why? I knew we couldn't afford it. I stared at her. So you were going to give up your dream because of money? She nodded. I didn't want to make things harder. I laughed softly. Emily, what? Dad didn't spend 30 years building a business so you'd stop dreaming. Tears filled her eyes. I miss him. So do I. She smiled through the tears. I think he'd be proud of you. I wasn't sure she was right. Back then, I still felt like a guy unloading boxes in a warehouse while the man who betrayed us kept winning. Then something unexpected happened. Mike called me. Meet me at Joe's Diner. It was one of Dad's favorite places. When I arrived, Mike wasn't alone. 3 former employees were sitting with him. Carlos, Ben, and Denise. Every one of them had worked with Dad for years. I looked around the table. What's going on? Mike leaned back. We quit. My eyebrows shot up. What? Richard? Carlos shook his head. We couldn't take him anymore. Denise laughed bitterly. He cut corners. Ben added, started ignoring safety inspections. Mike looked directly at me. Your father would have never allowed it. I listened quietly. Over the next hour they told me story after story. Experienced workers replaced with cheaper labor. Longtime clients ignored. Suppliers pressured into cutting quality. Employees threatened whenever they questioned decisions. The company my father built no longer existed. Only the name remained. Finally, Mike looked at me. What are you waiting for? I frowned. For what? Starting your own company. I almost laughed. I've got $12,000. So, I don't even own a truck. So, I don't have equipment. Mike smiled. Neither did your dad. That sentence hit me like a punch. He was right. Dad started with less than I had. Fear was becoming my excuse. A month later, I registered my first company. It wasn't impressive. The office was my apartment's spare bedroom. My desk came from a thrift store. My printer jammed every 3rd page. My company truck was a 15-year-old pickup with over 200,000 miles on it. But it was mine. The first 6 weeks were brutal. Nobody called. Nobody emailed. Nobody cared. Every morning I'd check my inbox. Nothing. I'd refresh again. Still nothing. I started wondering if Richard had been right. Maybe kindness really didn't build businesses. Maybe honest people always lost. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. A small property management company needed emergency concrete repairs. The contract was worth just under $1,800. It wasn't much, but to me, It felt like winning the lottery. I completed the project myself. Mixed the concrete, cleaned the site, sent the invoice. The client paid 2 days early. Even better, they left a 5-star review. That single review changed everything. A week later another customer called. Then another, then another. Within 6 months I couldn't handle every project alone. Hiring my first employee terrified me. What if business slowed down? What if I couldn't pay him? Then I remembered something Dad used to say. If you take care of good people, they'll take care of your business. So I hired someone, then another, then another. Unlike Richard, I knew every employee's spouse's name. I remembered birthdays. I visited job sites instead of hiding behind a desk. When mistakes happened, we fixed them instead of blaming someone else. People noticed, clients noticed, workers noticed, suppliers noticed. One Friday afternoon I received an email that made my hands shake. The sender's name looked familiar. Very familiar. It was one of the largest commercial developers in Columbus. The same company that had worked with Dad for almost 15 years. I assumed they wanted information. Instead, they requested a meeting. The following Monday I walked into their office wearing my only suit. It had been bought off the clearance rack 3 years earlier. The sleeves were slightly too short. I hoped nobody would notice. A woman named Karen greeted me. She was the company's operations director. After a few minutes of small talk, she smiled. I knew your father. My heart skipped. You did. He built 3 of our best facilities. She reached across the table and handed me a folder. We've been watching your company. I tried not to look surprised. Our company, she nodded. You remind us of someone. My dad, she smiled. He always answered his own phone. I laughed. So do I. He never overpromised. I try not to. He treated workers with respect. I looked down. I'm doing my best. Karen closed the folder. That's why you're here. She slid a contract toward me. The number printed at the bottom made my heart race. It was larger than every project I'd completed combined. For a second, I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just another job. This was the opportunity I'd been working toward for 3 years. Karen leaned forward. Can you handle it? I wanted to say yes immediately. Instead, I heard my father's voice in my head. Never promise what you can't deliver. So I answered, honestly, I can, but I'll need the right people. She smiled. That's the answer we hoped you'd give. As I walked back to my truck with the signed contract in my hands, I looked up at the sky without even realizing it. It felt strange, almost as if Dad had been walking beside me the entire time. I wasn't rich, I wasn't successful, not yet, but for the first time, I wasn't chasing my uncle anymore. I was building something he could never steal. Because this time, the foundation wasn't paperwork. It was trust, and somewhere across town, without realizing it, Richard had just lost his first client to the son he thought he'd destroyed.
I didn't realize our company had become a real threat until the day Richard called me. It was a Thursday morning. I was standing on the second floor of a commercial renovation project, wearing muddy work boots and a faded company hoodie, when my phone buzzed. The screen showed a number I hadn't seen in nearly 4 years. Richard. For a moment, I considered letting it ring. Then curiosity won. Hello. There was a long pause. So, you've been busy. His voice hadn't changed, still calm, still confident, still carrying the quiet arrogance that had haunted my family for years. I've been working, I replied. I've noticed. That was all he said before hanging up. No congratulations, no apology, no explanation, just those 3 words. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to inspecting the concrete forms. For the first time since my father's death, Richard wasn't someone I thought about every day. That realization felt strangely freeing. A few weeks later, Karen from the development company invited me to lunch. Halfway through the meeting, she smiled and said something that stopped me cold. You know your uncle came to see us. I looked up from my coffee. He did, she nodded. He wanted to know why we stopped giving him projects. I stayed quiet. Karen laughed softly. He assumed it was because your prices were lower. They aren't, I know. She stirred her coffee. We told him the truth. What truth? She looked directly at me. We trust you more. Those 4 words meant more to me than any contract. Growing up, Dad always said business wasn't about having the cheapest price. It was about becoming the person people trusted when millions of dollars were on the line. For years, I thought that philosophy had made him weak. Now I understood it had actually been his greatest strength. Over the next 18 months, our company doubled in size. Then it doubled again. We hired experienced project managers, opened a second office, bought newer equipment. Most importantly, we never forgot where we came from. Every Christmas, every employee received a bonus. When someone's child got sick, we made sure they had paid time off. If a worker suggested a better way to do something, we listened. Those weren't revolutionary ideas, they were simply the things my father had always done. One Friday afternoon, Mike walked into my office carrying a newspaper. He tossed it onto my desk without saying a word. The headline caught my attention immediately. Local construction company under investigation. The company in the article was Richards. I read every word: anonymous complaints, safety violations, delayed payments to subcontractors, possible financial misconduct. I leaned back in my chair. For years, I'd imagined this moment. I thought it would feel satisfying. Instead, I just felt tired. Mike crossed his arms. Karma finally showed up. I folded the newspaper. Maybe. You don't sound happy. I thought I would be. Weren't you waiting for this? I looked out the office window. No, I was waiting to stop caring. A few months later, the investigation became public. Several longtime clients canceled their contracts with Richard's company. Banks tightened his credit, suppliers demanded payment up front. The same reputation he'd spent decades building began falling apart in a matter of months. Trust leaves much faster than it arrives. One afternoon, our receptionist knocked on my office door. "There's someone here to see you." "Who is it?" She hesitated. Richard. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I nodded. "Send him in." He looked older, much older. His expensive suits were still perfectly tailored, but they couldn't hide the exhaustion on his face. The confidence was gone. He sat across from me without being invited. I noticed something strange. He kept looking around my office. At the employee photos, the company awards, the framed picture of my father hanging behind my desk. He stared at it longer than anything else. Finally, he spoke. "You've done well, thank you." Another silence. Then he cleared his throat. "I need your help." I almost smiled, not because I enjoyed seeing him struggle, because life has a strange sense of irony. The man who once threw us out of my father's company was now sitting inside mine asking for help. What kind of help? Our companies, he paused, could work together. I knew exactly what he meant. He wasn't proposing a partnership. He wanted access to our reputation, our clients, our stability. He wanted to survive. I don't think that's a good idea. His jaw tightened. "You should think about it." "I already have. We're family." The words hung in the air. Family. The same word he'd forgotten the day he forced my mother to choose which bills she could afford to pay. The same word that disappeared when Emily gave up her senior trip. The same word that meant nothing when he stood in my father's office and called us victims. I leaned forward. "You stopped being family the day you chose greed over your brother." For the first time in my life, Richard had no response. He looked at the floor, then quietly said something I never expected. "I made mistakes." I nodded. "You did. I can't change them." "No, I'm asking for another chance." I took a deep breath. There was a younger version of me that would have loved this moment. The angry 23-year-old who wanted revenge more than anything else. But that version of me no longer existed. "I forgive you." His eyes widened. "But I won't do business with you." He looked confused. "Why?" "Because forgiveness and trust aren't the same thing." Neither of us spoke. After a long moment, he stood up. As he reached the door, he stopped. "Your father would have helped me." I smiled sadly. "No, he would have forgiven you." I glanced at Dad's picture on the wall. "But he would have protected the people depending on him first." Richard lowered his head. Then he quietly walked out. That was the last conversation we ever had. About 6 months later, his company filed for bankruptcy. The building where my father had spent 30 years of his life was eventually sold to another developer. One Saturday morning, I drove past it with my mother. The old company sign had already been removed. For a long time, neither of us said anything. Then Mom smiled. "You know what? I used to think your father lost everything." She looked at me, but I was wrong. I parked across the street. "What do you mean?" She pointed toward one of our company trucks driving past the building. Our logo is printed across the side. Behind it was another truck. Then another. Employees wearing our uniforms waved as they passed. "Richard inherited a company." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You inherited your father's character." I felt my throat tighten. Because she was right. Richard had taken the buildings, the contracts, the equipment, but he had never taken the one thing that actually mattered. Dad's values. Those couldn't be signed away. They couldn't be stolen. They couldn't be inherited through paperwork. They had to be lived. Every decision, every employee, every client, every single day. A few weeks later, we held the grand opening of our new headquarters. Nearly everyone who had worked for my father in the early years was there. Mike gave a short speech. Karen attended with her entire executive team. Emily, now an architect, stood beside Mom cutting the ribbon. Before everyone left, I walked into my office alone. On the shelf sat my father's old silver watch, the same scratched watch he wore every day, not because it was expensive, because it reminded him where he'd started. I picked it up and fastened it around my wrist. It was still a little loose, just like it had been when I secretly tried it on as a kid. I smiled. For years, I believed success meant proving my uncle wrong. I couldn't have been more mistaken. Success wasn't watching him lose. Success was making sure my father's name lived on through the way we treated people. Because in the end, the company my uncle stole disappeared. The values my father built became the foundation of one that no one could ever take away. And that, more than any revenge I could have imagined, was the greatest victory of all.